To give a little bit of background to everyone about STEMX policy, if it's your first time here, STEMX policy was started around March last year. We had our first event, and we are an organization focused on educating STEM students about the importance of policymaking, engaging you in discussions regarding policy, and empowering STEM students to become leaders in policymaking. Part of our discussion it's really centered around the intersection of STEM and policy, as there's so many ways policy impacts our lives. And as STEM students, we're often not drawn attention to the nuances of how much policymaking impacts us, and how we can also get involved in this policymaking process and have an impact on the policies that would impact us. In one particular instance, we are often encouraged to be involved in research. We're given many opportunities to get involved, but there's a lot of ways that policy impacts research. And that's what we are here today to discuss, to understand all the different pieces, maybe not all, because I know there's a lot. Suzanne and Heather will be able to maybe give us a little bit of a crash course in the massive policies that do surround research, but we're hoping that today you do get a chance to learn a little bit more about how policies impact the ability for you to do research at the university, and concurrently how you can get involved in this policy making process. Before we get started, I'd just like to give a really big thank you to the whole entire STEMX policy team. It really wouldn't be possible without all the executives and the coordinators who work tirelessly to host our events. You see some of them are on camera right now. Lana and Sarah are our co-VPs of events and programming, and they took a lot of leadership in organizing this event. Just to run through a few housekeeping things, please stay on mute throughout the portion while our speakers are presenting, and hold your questions until we open breakout rooms. And with that, I'd like to pass it over to Lana and Sarah.
Okay, hi everybody. Thank you all for coming to our STEMX Policies Snapshot seminar on research ethics. My name is Lana. I will be co-hosting this event with Sarah. And first off, we'd like to start off by thanking our wonderful speakers, Dr. Suzanne McMurphy and Heather Pratt, and we really appreciate them joining and sharing their insight on research policy with us, because there's definitely a lot for us to learn this is why we're here. We'd like to start off with a couple Mentimeter questions, so I will just share those with you guys now. And we'd be glad if you guys could take part and kind of let us know what you guys already know. And let's see. There we go. So the code to join is on the top, and you guys can input whatever you think the answer is. These are some really good answers. We'll just give it a couple more minutes.
I really love this one about policy governing who owns the research results.
Okay, I haven't seen any new ones in a little bit, so I think we're good to move on. What do you guys think? Right. Yeah, now I'll pass it on to Zara.
And now we would like to introduce our first speaker, Heather Pratt, who is the Executive Director of the University of Windsor Research and Innovation Services.
Thanks, Sarah. And I want to echo Anamita's recognition of the great work that you guys have done to organize this. This has been really seamless. So just my shout out to you. Good job with that. I sent you guys the slide deck. Do you have it, or do you want me to share?
Whatever is easiest for you. Would you like us to share it?
That might be easier because I have, yeah, whenever I share, well, I can do it. I've got it right here.
I was just about to try. I've got it open. Go ahead.
Can you see that?
There you go. Perfect. Yeah, it's awesome.
All right. Yeah, can you see okay? All right, so yeah, so my name is Heather Pratt, Executive Director, Research and Innovation at the university in the Office of Research and Innovation Services. And today I'm going to talk about some of the policies that we have at the university that are supporting the research enterprise, so all the research and innovation activities that are taking place on campus. So why policy matters to research? So there's a lot of reasons, like you can't just have research happening without some kind of accountability framework. So first and foremost is the accountability and the transparency in finances, but also in the research activities as well. We want to be sure that any research that is taking place at the university is being done in an open, transparent, accountable manner, and that all the finances that are secured to support those research activities are being spent in accordance with university policy and also funding agency policy as well. I think most importantly, though, is the understanding the rights, duties, and responsibilities. So that's really the responsible conduct of research and ensuring that research is being done in accordance to agency guidelines, institutional policies and procedures. There might be governing councils as well that I'll talk about a little bit later. But really, we need to have that strong framework that defines what how the research needs to be taking place. Also, it provides consistency and equity for our researchers. So whether it's faculty, students, staff, researcher, the policy is outlined and it provides that framework for how research can be conducted. And then also supports the excellence in treatment of research personnel. So some of our HR policies and things, payroll policies, some of the finance policies as well, helps to ensure that, that we have excellence in treatment of our research personnel. So to back up a little bit, I just want to explain the kind of the foundation of all of the framework for our research activities at the university. So the university in 2018 entered into the Tri-Council Administration Agreement. There's a whole lot of other iterations. Basically, without this agreement, this administration agreement, the university would not be able to hold any kind of grant funding, whether it be NSERC, SHRC, CIHR, any kind of funding. This Tri-Council Administration Agreement provides the assurances to the Tri-Council that the university has the framework in place to support the responsible and effective administration of all research funding. So it defines, that agreement defines the roles and responsibilities of all parties. So the agencies, the institution, and the researchers. Also defines the responsible conduct of research. And there is a framework for the responsible conduct of research that is very, very strong. And there's now also a secretariat that supports the responsible conduct of research. Because when policy is breached, sometimes, unfortunately, it is an issue in terms of responsible conduct of research that requires further investigation by both the institution and the funding agency. So some of the requirements within that responsible conduct of research involves policies around research involving humans, and the Tri-Council Policy Statement 2 that I know Dr. McMurphy will be talking about later, and any research involving animals. So that would be the Canada Council on Animal Care, so CCAC. Both provide a very strong and robust framework for guiding research and how research should be done in terms of ensuring, like in the case of animals, that no animals suffer any undue harm, and it's the same with any research involving humans, that there's no harm with any of the human participants in the study that you might be conducting. It also provides the framework for the financial administration that I talked about earlier. So, it's really important to ensure that the funding that might be secured to support research activities is being spent in accordance with institutional policies and also with any funding agency policies. Because if there is any kind of breach, that could again jeopardize and put us in breach of our Tri-Council administration agreement that could jeopardize our ability to hold funding. So that accountability-based framework is guided by the Tri-Agency Financial Administration Guide, the TAGFA. One of the things you're going to find if you're staying in the research environment is there's all sorts of acronyms. So the TAGFA is kind of the overarching framework. It is a principles-based framework. The Tri-Council used to have a very prescriptive set of policies and eligibility and things like that. They have now pushed that to the institutions. So they require the institutions to have all of the policies, procedures, and the frameworks in place to effectively administer, and they provide that overarching framework. Without that agreement, again, we would not be able to apply for or hold any Tri-Council grants. Now, to put that into perspective, last year in fiscal 2020-2021, the external research revenue secured by the University of Windsor was $37 million. Of that funding, $10 million was from Tri-Council. So it's not an insignificant amount of money. So just to frame the importance of having an effective framework and policy in place. So some of the key research policies that we have at the University of Windsor that are supporting the administration of the Tri-Council requirements. We do have the research integrity and responsible conduct of research policy, which I mentioned earlier. We really don't like it when we have to make reference to that because it usually means there's some kind of breach or some kind of challenge that we've identified. Of course, finance policies. Finance has a very strong, robust set of policies. So there's a travel policy, the purchasing policy, and also a little bit of complexity, although we have the purchasing policy because we're an institution, not a financial institution, a post-secondary institution funded by the province of Ontario. We also fall under the broader public sector guidelines. So that is a requirement that really provides a framework for how purchasing needs to be taking place within an institution. That covers municipalities, universities, schools, and hospitals as well. So the MUSH sector, you might have heard the MUSH sector referenced before. We also have policy for research overhead costs, central research facility overhead, establishment of research grant or contract accounts. We have research chairs policy, and we also have an equity, diversity, and inclusion in research policy that was recently developed as part of the implementation of the new TAGFA. Some other important policies that we have in place, the Canada Research Chair Standard Budget Policy. The University of Windsor has, I think, 10 Canada Research Chairs. These are very kind of select group of people. There's only 2,200 Canada Research Chairs nationally. So the allocation of our research chairs is based on our Tri-Council funding and a 3-year average of the funding. So Within the Canada Research Chairs, though, we do have a standard budget policy that outlines the framework and again provides the consistency and equity in how the budgets for our Canada Research Chairs are handled. We have, closure of internal research grants, former employees, closure of research leadership chair internally funded accounts, submission of proposal documents by principal investigators, and establishing a lab fees account. So where can our policies be found? Our ORS policies are all on the Central Policies website, so the windsor.ca/policies. We also have them on our ORS website, and there's a picture here. I don't know if you can see it, but on our ORS site, research policies, and we do have the policies that I've just talked about there. There's also some other policies that provide a better framework of the institutional policies from other departments as well. So talking about policies and other units that impact research, these are pretty broad. So we have a lot of policies impacting safety on campus. And I know that all of you in STEM and in science, I'm sure you're familiar with some of the requirements right now for research safety. It's really important that any research that's being done in a lab is being done in a safe manner so that we can ensure the safety of everybody in the lab. We also have the policies that are governing employment and human resources, especially employment equity. So there's a very broad employment equity policy. And I know that there is, with the recent appointment of the Vice President of EDI, they're also in the process of developing an institutional EDI policy. We have policies outlining the things the university will pay for. Again, that would be the finances, what expenditures are eligible and also what can be purchased, how it can be purchased. The purchasing policy as well outlines anything under $2,500 you don't need a purchase order for. From $2,500 to I think it's $25,000, you need to have 3 quotes. Anything over $25,000, I always refer people to procurement because there's anything over $100,000 has to be posted publicly on MERCs as well. So we do have some pretty strong policies that help our researchers identify what is eligible and how that should be processed, because a faculty member who's secured research funding can't just engage with any service provider to procure goods in excess of, say if they wanted to procure goods of $25,000, that would be problematic for us. We have a conflict of interest policy. Now that's a Senate policy and it governs all the conflict of interest with the across the university. Open access policy, that's through our library. And the library took the lead on that and we worked with them on that. And there's communication policies as well that are managed through the Public Affairs Department. So some of the other guidelines that we have for researchers, and a lot of these are external guidelines that we have to follow. Again, the human participants, the TCPS2 that Dr. McMurphy will talk about in a bit. Also, any kind of animal research. The Canada Council on Animal Care has very prescriptive requirements that we have to follow. We do have regular monitoring visits as well. We just had one last year. It was done virtually, which was a little bit more challenging, but we did conduct that. So that's a rather lengthy process that we're just working on right now, finalizing things. We have policies as well that outline any potential harmful substances. So that would be like WHMIS, workplace health and sorry, I live in acronyms. I cannot remember what that acronym stands for now. Also though, lasers, x-rays, radioactive materials, there's federal guidelines and requirements that prescribe how we monitor that, how we approve those, that type of research and how we report on it. Of course, environmental hazards, that's something that, again, there's a couple different layers there in terms of federal, provincial, and even municipal in some cases requirements. And then of course, controlled goods. So such as firearms, narcotics, cannabis, if there's any kind of technology that might be possibly used for any kind of warfare, that would fall under the controlled goods. And that's a very complex policy. And that's managed through our health and safety unit as well. So the process of policy development, it's can be quite complex. Usually it starts when we identify a need, right? So if there's a process that's causing a problem, there might be a government mandate that's changed. So, again, I use the example of the new Tri-Agency Financial Administration Guidelines, the TAGFA. That was a significant requirement that we had to go, we had to do an environmental scan, and we had to identify, kind of do a stopgap analysis. So what policies do we have? What policies will we be required to have? What policies will we need to develop? And then also if there's a lack of knowledge about the correct way to do something. If we're just finding that we keep on running into a challenge, we might identify that we think we need a policy or we need a standard operating procedure. But usually it starts with policy, and then the standard operating procedure would identify how that would be operationalized within the university. The next step would be the policy would be drafted. Now, in this case, I'm just using ORIS as an example. There's certainly policies that are developed across the institution. So in this case, in my office, we would research other policies, perhaps at other institutions, other organizations, and then we would rough out some of those ideas, and we would start drafting that internal draft. So, internally, we would have a lot of back and forth, and then we would engage any other party within the university that we might need to consult with or collaborate with, which leads to stakeholders consulted. So again, from the perspective of ORIS, we would engage other business units to review the draft, and again, some back and forth to refine it, make sure that everybody's satisfied with it, make sure we're addressing all the pain points that have been identified as well, especially when we've identified that there's a process that's causing a problem. Then we would potentially arrange for meetings with faculty or other administrations, depending on the nature of the policy. It might have to be a consultative process, and I'll touch on that in a minute as well. It might need to go to the executive leadership team for their review and approval. And in some cases, it might need to go to Senate for review and approval as well. We would also review collective agreements within the university. So faculty collective agreements, we have staff collective agreements as well, because we want to be sure that we're not contravening any of the terms that might be in the collective agreement. Finally, the draft would be revised, and policy would be approved. And again, there's different mechanisms for that policy approval, depending on the nature of the policy. So we do have like institutional policies, things like intellectual property policy is something that we're working on now. Definitely would need Senate approval because it will cover the entire institution. Some of the other policies that we have, though, the EDI and research policy is something that we had developed within my office, consulting with ORIA as well. Because it was a gap in the TAGFA rollout, and we were not able to wait until we had some kind of an institutional strategy. So that was our approach for developing that policy. I should say as well that in those cases, the VPRI does approve those policies. So principal stakeholders, the Government of Canada, the federal government, so NSERC, SSHRC, CIHR most notably, but we also have the Canada Foundation for Innovation, a lot of other funding agencies, the FedDev agency, province of Ontario. We secure a lot of funding from the province of Ontario. From a research perspective, mostly the Ministry of Colleges and University and the Ministry of Economic Development and Job Creation. Again, collective bargaining units, that might be faculty, might be staff, might be students as well. Individual faculty members, we would consult, depending on the nature of the policy, we would consult with individual faculty members. And research personnel, we would, research personnel are key stakeholders as well, because without research personnel, the research can't be undertaken. Also, again, as I've mentioned, other university Windsor business units and administrative staff and personnel. So policy gaps. So we're always seeming to find policy gaps. It seems like, just when we think we've got things tied up, that we identify another gap. So some of the policy gaps that we're working on right now, eligibility of different kinds of researchers to hold grants. That's something that continues to be a challenge for us because we have a lot of different faculty appointments. So we are working on an eligibility policy right now. We're doing that in conjunction with the Vice President Research and Innovation Office and the Finance Office. Also, we're working with advancement and finance on developing a philanthropic supportive research activities. That's something that we've been kind of stumbling through when we have a generous donor who wants to provide support for research activities on campus. It's been challenging. So that's, again, when I talked about having a problem that you identify, this is where having a policy can provide us with some guidance to how to administer this, so that depending, it doesn't matter if there's turnover in those other units, that there's a framework in place that can be referred back to. The biggest one that we're working on right now is the intellectual property policy. That's being led by Professor Myra Topik in the Faculty of Law, and those consultations are starting. Over the summer and the past couple of months, we've been doing a lot of background research, reviewing a lot of other policies at other institutions, and it is something that we're targeting to have that policy developed by the end of next year. Research data management policy, again, that's a policy that's in development with the Research Ethics Board and Dr. McMurphy, the library, the ITS department as well, and the Office of Research and Innovation. That's a tri-council requirement. That's a new requirement that they've been slowly rolling out over the last couple of years. I think we are in good shape for the deployment of that policy, and there has been some significant work done to develop that. And that's all I have. So if you have any questions, there's my contact information, and you can contact me directly, or you can contact our ORS mailbox. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you, Heather Pratt, for your insight on policies impacting research at the University of Windsor. Next, we want to introduce Dr. Suzanne Murphy. Among her many other qualifications, she's currently the chair of the Research Ethics Board, and she'll be speaking on the topic of research policy at the University of Windsor specifically.
Can you see that?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. Okay, good.
Dr. Murphy, thank you.
Fine. First, let me say thank you so much for inviting me back. It's very exciting to be back with your group. I was here a while ago when we were talking about public health policy and COVID vaccines, and it was really exciting. I think your group is great. I love hearing people talk about policy, and so this is really exciting. So thanks again for inviting me. You gave me 4 questions for my presentation, so I'm going to answer those 4 questions, and I organized my talk around these. They're great questions, but they do take you into a kind of a lot of depth. So my slides are going to have a lot of content on them, so you're welcome to distribute them when I'm finished. So the first question you ask is, what are the goals of the Research Ethics Board, and what purpose does it serve in our local community? So as Heather Pratt mentioned, the Tri-Council policy statement on the ethical conduct for research involving humans is the particular policy that we are responsible for implementing at the University of Windsor, and that we refer to as the TCPS2. And it indicates that the primary goal of the REB is to ensure the ethical acceptability of research involving human participants that falls within the scope of the policy. There are things which occur with humans which fall outside of our scope. We only look at things which are related to research and humans involved in research. Now, there's also a mandate for the Research Ethics Board, which is to review the ethical acceptability of research on behalf of the institution, which means that we can approve, we can reject, we can propose modifications to, we can terminate any project under the TCPS2 guidance. And then the institution has to appoint us as an REB to accept the ethical acceptability of research on behalf of the institution. So we operate what might say as arm's length to the university. We are also, in policy language, we are an unfunded mandate, which means that we are required to exist. The university is required to create us, but there is no one who actually funds us. So we are what is called in policy language an unfunded mandate. We review all research that involves humans by anybody who's affiliated with us. So that means that faculty, staff, students, community members, other researchers that are affiliated with the University of Windsor all must go through us if they are doing any kind of research that involves humans. But so one thing that's important is to define humans under the policy. So we cover living human participants, we cover human biological materials. So for those of you in STEM, these are things like tissues, these are human biological elements, these are anything that is related to humans, including bones, because we also cover living and deceased individuals. So human participants, as the TCPS2 defines them, are those individuals whose data, biological materials, or responses to interventions, stimuli, or questions by the researcher are relevant to answering the research question. So one of the things we also need to determine when something comes to us is this research, and is this research that involves humans or human biological elements or their data? So one of the things we talked about before when I spoke with you is whenever you talk about a policy, you should always look at where the policy mandate comes from and what kind of context the policy operates in. So the first international guidelines for research with humans was codified in the Nuremberg Code in 1947, and it outlined 10 principles that all researchers need to follow whenever they're including humans. And this is where we get some of those policies like informed consent, voluntary participation, risk-benefit assessment, the ability to withdraw, scientifically trained researchers, which is why all of you are getting trained in research methods, because in order to engage in research, these principles indicate that you need to be scientifically trained. Beyond that, in 1964 was the Helsinki Declaration, and the Helsinki Declaration then was adopted by the World Medical Association in 1964. So the Helsinki Declaration is the ethical principles for medical research involving human subjects, but it is now expanded to cover all research covering human participants. So it became the basic international foundation for all nations that signed on to the Helsinki Declaration. So their guideline number 10 says that the Helsinki standards cannot be reduced or eliminated by any national or international policies. So our TCPS2 must meet the standards of the Helsinki Declaration in order to exist. It covers all research now, like I said, regardless of methodology. It's not just medical research any longer. And it has 37 guidelines that talk about the research involving humans. And so our researchers must also follow the Helsinki Declaration as it's codified in the TCPS2. Now, guideline number 23 was what created research ethics committees. So that guideline says that all research institutions must have a committee that considers, comments, and approves research that is involved under their institution. So we have to take into consideration not only the laws of our own country, but wherever research is taking place around the world. So we, as the REB, must be aware of all other international standards and all other ethical frameworks that exist around the world when one of our researchers is traveling to another country. So I also wanted to talk a little bit about when we say the REB, what does that mean? Because it sounds like there's a committee. In fact, the University of Windsor's REB is made up of 2 sections. So in 6.1 under the TCPS2 is the actual review process and the review committees that come together to review all the applications from researchers with research involving humans. But the other thing 6.2 in the TCPS2 indicates is there needs to be an administrative body which facilitates that review process. So that's the Office of Research Ethics. So when we say the REB, we're actually talking about 2 different groups of activities, the review activities as well as the administrative activities. So this is a little blurry, but this is basically the review activity. So above those 2 activities, I'm going to talk about the review activities, and this is the process that we go through. So while we talk about the REB, I actually, in fact, have 7 committees that I chair, and that's so that we can actually get research moving more quickly because I can have multiple committees reviewing applications at the same time. Most interesting for you is my Biomedical Board, which reviews all hospital-based research. We are the REB for all hospitals except for Windsor Regional. And Windsor Regional, we have a memorandum of understanding so that we share our reviews together. I have a socio-behavioral board, which is a full board, which reviews things which are more than minimal risk. And then I've got several other committees that I can send applications to so that I can have multiple people reviewing applications at the same time so that I can keep research moving relatively quickly. So that answers your question number 1 of sort of what's the goal of the REB and sort of what is the REB. I'm going to flip over to question 3 next, because this shows you the REB in kind of its context. So your question was, who are the key players locally, provincially, and federally that regulate research or ethics policies to the University of Windsor? So I highlighted the word regulate, because in fact, the only policies that we have to abide by are the Helsinki Declaration primarily, and that's embodied in the Tri-Council Policy Statement, the Ethical Conduct for Research Involving Humans, that's the TCPS2. So those are our direct regulatory guidance that we need to implement. Then we have our own regulations that we have developed in relationship to the TCPS2 as things are implemented here at the University of Windsor. And those are the University of Windsor guidelines for research involving human participants. You can find those on our website. And then, as Heather mentioned, we then must respond to tri-agency policies that are established. So the responsible conduct of research that she mentioned is one thing that we also need to abide by. The data management policy that has recently been passed by the tri-agencies. We also are responsible for ensuring that our researchers are following that as it relates to human participants. The panel on research ethics reviews and interprets the TCPS2. So their interpretations of the TCPS2 we must also follow. And then there are a few other things that we need to be aware of that we need to follow depending upon what kinds of research is being conducted. So clinical trials, for example, fall under Health Canada. So we need to be aware of the Division 5 regulations under Health Canada. We also need to be aware of ICH E6, which is the International Committee on Harmonization, and that's good clinical practice, and that's the international standard. So we need to be aware of that. Provincially, we need to be aware of the Personal Health Information Protection Act. So anybody doing research involving protected health information, we need to know PHIPAA. And then as we move out internationally, we need to be aware of what's called CIOMS. So CIOMS is the International Ethical Guidelines for Health-Related Research. That's what the World Health Organization follows. So we need to know CIOMS. There's a brand new policy that came out as a result of COVID, and that's called clinical research in resource limited settings. So in other words, our researchers that are going to Africa, our researchers are going to other part of the world that are conducting research in low resource settings. We need to follow this brand new guideline that came out in 2021. I mentioned ICHE6, that's the good clinical practice for anybody doing health-related research that's related to a clinical trial. Anybody doing data management, when they're in Europe, they've got to follow GDPR, so we've got to know the GDPR regulations as well. And then because we're a border city, we have a lot of research that goes on in the United States. So we need to know their ethical policies. So what we sort of affectionately refer to as 45 CFR 46, that's the United States law. So unlike in Canada, which is, we have a set of guidelines that we implement, in the United States is actually a law that you must follow regarding the protection of human subjects. And then if you're doing a clinical trial, because we have a number of clinical trials going on with the hospitals in Michigan, we have to follow then the Food and Drug Administration's clinical trials regulations, and that's 21 CFR 50. And then there are some specialty guidelines that have an effect on what we do, and those are things like internet policies. So each of the internet platforms has a policy that guides how researchers can engage with them, so we need to know those kinds of policies. The school boards for faculty and education that are doing research in school boards, we need to know the school board's policies. So there are a whole series of policies that we need to be aware of whenever we're reviewing somebody's application. But primarily, we follow the Helsinki Declaration, the TCPS2, and whatever policies the tri-agency sets for us. Now, there was another way you could have asked that question. So I'm also going to give you this really quickly, because the other way to think about this are who are the key players locally, provincially, and federally that influence or engage with the research policies here, and what's their role? So if you move through the research process, Heather just talked about funding. So all of those kind of policies related to funding are those kinds of things which will impact on research. Research partners may come from other places that also have policies that they need to follow. So their institution may have local policies. Our industry partners may have policies. Then recruitment pathways, they may have particular policies around how you may disseminate, how you may identify participants, how you may recruit them. The hospital has policies about how you can do research in relationship to them. Then you've got policies related to data sources. So how do you access data? What kind of policy do you need to follow in order to be able to get sensitive data or protected data? Moving on into implementation, then you've got things like protocol alignment, those policies that we need to monitor to ensure that you're following the protocol that was cleared by us. You've got researcher integrity that Heather mentioned. You've also got compliance with other kinds of laws that researchers may need to follow, so we need to be aware of those. And then for you in STEM, we've got materials issues. So you've got collection of materials, you've got transport of materials, you've got storage of materials. So those fall all under your safety policies. And then you've got analysis and storage, you've got computer access, software platforms, confidential storage that may have policies that may affect the way in which you can store data or access data. And then finally, I'm really glad somebody said in that larger picture around dissemination, because it's true. Once you send that article off for publication, they actually own your article then. So you can't actually send that article around. So that question's really, really critical about, okay, so who owns your data once you've sent something off for publication? You know, how can you distribute it? You know, who owns it? So that was a really good question, because that policy may also affect you. So moving around this circle, as you move around the research process, there are policies that you might run into that will have an effect on the way in which you can conduct your research. So back to your second question. So your second question is, what are the possible consequences of ignoring or underestimating the impact of ethical principles? So first of all, let's talk about the consequences to participants. So participants could be exposed to unmitigated risks. They could be harmed socially, psychologically, physically. Communities could be harmed by the way in which research is conducted. And the trust in research and researchers and the University of Windsor scientific community can be betrayed and can be permanently lost if our researchers act in ways that are unethical or violate particular policies. For the scientific community, so contributions to science can be damaged, research findings can be deemed unusable. There's a really good website that you should go take a look at, which is called Retraction Watch, because they'll talk about all the consequences of unethical research. Articles can be retracted. I've had to retract 2 articles this year, for example, for reasons of confidentiality protections and violations. And then for researchers, data can be seized. I have to sometimes seize data when people have collected data without REB clearance. I have had to actually ask for the data to be given to me, and I archive it then, and it can't be used for research. Projects can be suspended, they can be terminated. I've had to do that as well. It doesn't happen very often, but every once in a while something will go wrong and we'll have to suspend a project. Thesis, dissertations, and degrees can be retracted. If people have not followed ethical guidelines, they haven't gotten REB clearance, or something goes wrong in their study, we can actually retract those degrees. And then finally, the worst, and we hope this never happens, but every once in a while something can occur, which is academic misconduct, which can then result in the loss of funding, your academic position. You can be barred from obtaining grant funding in the future, academic positions, et cetera. And just on a little ending note, there have been 18,000 articles that have been retracted in the past 5 years. And of those, 15% have been retracted because they didn't have REB clearance when they conducted their study. And then finally, your last question was, how can the University of Windsor students get involved in Research Ethics Board or other research policy related activities? So contact us, once the holidays are over, contact us in January. We do have volunteer positions at the University at the Office of Research Ethics. We do have volunteers, we do have work study students. So there are some positions. And then all of our REB boards and committees have student members. So if you're interested in sitting on one of the boards, or you're interested in sitting in a committee, then we'll be sending out new appointment letters in January. So please let us know if you're interested in being part of that. And then I left you with a slide that defines what actual research is, just in case anybody asked me. Okay.
Thank you so much, Dr. Suzanne McMurphy, for sharing your expertise in the topic of research ethics. So now we'll be transitioning into a Kahoot game.
Okay.